You may not know this, but during World War II, Hitler ordered the construction of a prison with an impenetrable defense system, a place where any captured escapees would be sent. In other words, this facility was built specifically to prevent further escape attempts. However, desperate times breed extraordinary individuals. At this very moment, there was one prisoner determined, absolutely insistent, on breaking out of this fortress by any means necessary. He even decided to help dozens of others escape with him. This is a story of meticulous planning and remarkable ingenuity, a story that becomes more astonishing the deeper you go. So don't miss a single detail, and watch until the very end. In 1943, World War II was at its peak, the largest armed conflict in history, lasting 6 long years. During this time, Germany, under Hitler's leadership, had invaded most of Europe, capturing countless soldiers and declaring them prisoners of war. Massive prison camps were continuously established to hold these captives. Most prisoners tried to escape, and many succeeded, largely because they weren't held in actual high-security prisons. These were military barracks, flimsy compared to concrete walls and iron bars, so escape was often possible. Still, most escapees were eventually caught and brought back. Following Hitler's orders, the Germans began building more sophisticated camps, facilities specifically designed to make escape impossible. As a result, those with prior escape attempts were often transferred to these maximum security sites. The most infamous of these was Stalag Luft 3. It was engineered to make breaking out virtually impossible. The prison buildings were mounted on sturdy concrete stilts, elevated about 2 feet above the ground. That meant tunneling underneath was almost impossible, as any digging would be immediately noticed. On top of that, the soil inside the compound was loose and sandy, making tunnels prone to instant collapse. To make matters worse, microphones were buried underground to detect even the faintest sound of digging. The compound was surrounded by 2 barbed wire fences, reinforced and constantly patrolled from guard towers that kept watch around the clock. Escaping from here was as close to impossible as it gets, but among the prisoners was one man, a man with the will and determination to punch through those barriers and escape at any cost. Not only that, he planned to take hundreds of fellow inmates with him. His name was Roger Bushell, a Royal Air Force pilot during the war. He flew missions over France against the Germans until his plane was shot down. Bushell parachuted to safety, but was quickly captured by German forces. This man had a reputation. Every time he was locked up, he would find a way to break out, only to be captured again. He had escaped multiple times from previous camps, but one particular escape caused far more trouble for him. On that occasion, he fled with a fellow prisoner, a soldier from Czechoslovakia. Their goal was to reach Czechoslovakia and hide there. At the time, the country was under German occupation. When they arrived, Bushell and his companion found refuge with a local family. The family showed compassion, cared for them, and kept them hidden from the German soldiers. The problem was that, at that very moment in Czechoslovakia, one of Germany's most important commanders had been assassinated. In retaliation, the German military launched a massive manhunt across the country, arresting anyone they suspected and, in many cases, executing them on the spot. When German soldiers began searching the area where the family lived, Roger Bushell and his companion decided to leave in order not to put the family in danger. But their escape didn't last long. They were caught almost immediately. Although Roger and his friend never revealed the identities of the family or anyone who had helped them, it seems the family's neighbors betrayed them, likely out of fear of punishment. As a result, German soldiers executed every member of that family. This loss left a deep scar on Roger Bushell and fueled his hatred for the Nazis more than ever before. From that moment on, he was determined to destroy the Nazi regime by any means necessary. The problem was that the Germans had now placed him in Stalag Luft 3. This prison was located on Polish soil, which was still under German occupation at the time. As mentioned earlier, it was designed specifically to hold prisoners of war who had previously attempted escapes, making it the most secure facility of them all. Still, this did nothing to deter Roger from planning another breakout. The moment he arrived, he began thinking about ways to get out. First, he focused on building friendships with other prisoners, getting to know them and earning their trust. Eventually, he formed a small, tight-knit group of 5 or 6 men. We'll call them the Leadership Council. Their mission was to secretly get as many prisoners out of the camp as possible. Roger's ultimate goal was to undermine German power. If hundreds of enemy soldiers managed to escape into occupied territory, it would force the Germans to spread their forces thin, especially since most of these prisoners were highly experienced and often held high ranks. The Germans would fear these men could stir up trouble behind enemy lines, diverting valuable manpower from the front to deal with chaos at home. With the objective set, all that remained was a meticulous plan to make it happen. The only viable option was to dig a tunnel to freedom. But this was complicated by the camp's defensive structures and strict security protocols, as well as the challenge of digging without being detected. Guards were always alert for signs of tunneling and constantly inspected for any underground passageways. This is where Roger's clever idea came in. Instead of digging just one tunnel, they would dig 3, each in a different location within the camp. The logic was simple. If the guards discovered one tunnel, they would likely never suspect that others were being dug simultaneously. The problem, however, was that the guards here weren't ordinary. They were special forces soldiers known as ferrets, hand-picked and trained under Hitler's orders, highly skilled in dealing with prisoners and detecting escape attempts. This was their specialty. Roger and his leadership council were facing a formidable opponent, so maintaining the secrecy of their operation was their top priority. Their first move was to give each tunnel an ordinary man's name. The first was Tom, the second David, and the third Harry. This way, whenever they discussed the tunnels, they could speak in code. For example, they could say, "We'll visit Harry tonight," or "Tom is in good spirits," or "What's David up to?" This ensured that even if someone overheard them, they would have no idea the conversation was actually about escape tunnels. One of the main strategies the prison guards used was planting an informant among the inmates, a man who pretended to be a fellow prisoner but was, in fact, feeding information back to the guards. These informants were often new arrivals or transfers from other prisons. The veteran prisoners had a clever and highly effective way of spotting these infiltrators. Their method worked like this. When a new prisoner arrived, they would sit down and talk with him, asking how he was captured and where he came from. For example, if he said, "I'm from London," the veterans would bring over another trusted inmate who was also from London. That prisoner would then question the newcomer about the city, its weather, the people, the neighborhoods, the landmarks, even the street he lived on. These were very specific questions that only a real Londoner could answer. In effect, it was a friendly interrogation designed to determine whether the newcomer was truly a fellow soldier or a plant working for the guards. If they discovered the man was an informant, they would tell the guards outright, "This is not a genuine soldier. He's one of your spies." And then they would give the guards a choice: remove him from the camp, or they could no longer guarantee his safety. Since Roger's plan involved helping hundreds of prisoners escape, he had to make absolutely sure there were no informants in their midst. If there were, the entire operation could be compromised, and lives would be at risk. Imagine, the camp held around 600 prisoners, and Roger wanted to get at least 200 of them out. Pulling off an escape of that scale was an enormous challenge. Roger and the members of the Leadership Council were the only ones who knew the full plan. As for the prisoners helping them, each group knew only the one piece of information necessary for their specific role. They had no idea about the entire scheme. For example, one group knew only about Tunnel Harry, another knew only about David, and another only about Tom. A fourth group handled equipment, while a fifth group was responsible for disposing of the excavated soil and similar tasks. Each man had a single job and was aware only of that job, ensuring maximum secrecy. The Leadership Council also understood they needed a dedicated intelligence network to monitor the guards, knowing their positions and movements at all times. So, what did they do? They stationed certain prisoners in strategic spots around the camp, positions that gave them a clear view of guard activity. If work was being done in a sensitive area and they needed to make sure no guard saw it, They relied on a human-powered early warning system. When a guard approached, the first lookout would perform a specific gesture, say, turning his cap a certain way. The second lookout, seeing this, might stretch his arms. The third, noticing the stretch, would scratch his arm. Each gesture was a coded signal passed from one man to the next, eventually reaching the location where the secret work was taking place. This allowed the workers to stop immediately, whether they were digging, moving soil, or building equipment, before any guard could spot them. The brilliance of this system was that any prisoners not involved in the escape had no idea what these gestures meant, preserving the secrecy and effectiveness of the plan. That was the discipline the Leadership Council lived by. To keep the operation hidden, even the participants didn't know the full scope of what was going on. Now let's turn to the tunneling itself. The first problem was the ground under the prison. The soil was extremely soft, almost like sand. This meant the tunnels would need reinforcement to keep from collapsing. Their solution? They began removing and cutting wooden boards from the prisoners' beds inside the camp. Let's say they had already obtained the wooden boards. The next challenge was figuring out how to get them into the tunnel. They also needed hammers and nails, but even if they had those tools, they couldn't use them, because the sound of hammering would be loud enough to be picked up by the underground microphones. So, they had to come up with another method. They devised a very clever engineering system that allowed the boards to interlock. They cut the boards into pieces shaped like cubes that could fit together. By assembling and connecting these pieces, they could reinforce and support the tunnel walls, preventing collapses. However, they had to handle these boards with extreme care. One wrong move could cause several pieces, or even an entire section to come crashing down. Now came another question. How could they cut these boards from the prison beds and shape them into the desired interlocking cubes? In the prisoners' quarters, there was a gramophone, a record player that allowed inmates to listen to music in their huts. Inside these gramophones was a tightly wound metal spring. Once removed and straightened, it was strong and sharp enough to function like a saw. This became the tool the prisoners used to cut the boards from their beds. Once they had enough tools, Roger and his men continued digging. But the tunnels had to go deep. If they were too close to the surface, the microphones could detect the sound of digging. After reaching the necessary depth, they had to dig horizontally, heading beyond the prison walls. The goal was to get the tunnel exit as far as possible into the forest, concealed within thick bushes. This meant the tunnels could easily reach over 100 meters in length. You can imagine how difficult it was to dig such a long distance in these conditions and with such primitive tools. What made it even harder was the fact they were building 3 tunnels to the same standard. Fortunately, the involvement of many prisoners in the plan made the work possible. The next problem was how to get rid of the excess soil without raising suspicion. The prisoners would fill bags with soil, hide them in their trousers, and discreetly dump the dirt into the prison's vegetable garden. Through it all, the most critical factor was the tunnel entrances. Only the Leadership Council and the prisoners responsible for digging and reinforcing the tunnels knew their exact locations. These entrances had to remain an absolute secret. If even one was discovered, the entire plan would collapse. So, where were they? As mentioned earlier, the prison buildings were elevated off the ground, resting on concrete pillars, which meant the ground beneath them was visible. How could they possibly dig without making the entrance obvious? The tunnel openings were hidden within certain main concrete pillars, specifically the ones used to carry underground water pipes and electrical lines. Some of these pillars were larger than others, depending on the size of the utilities they housed. The first entrance, for Tunnel Harry, was located beneath a fireplace in one of the huts. Each hut had a fireplace set on a ceramic plate because the metal stove was hot and couldn't sit directly on the wooden floor. By sheer luck, this particular fireplace sat directly on top of one of the large concrete pillars. The prisoners lifted the stove and ceramic plate, then began digging beneath the pillar. The stove itself became the perfect cover for the tunnel entrance. Guards would never suspect it, since they were the ones who had installed it there in the first place. As for the second tunnel, David, its entrance was in the bathhouse drain. They dug directly through this drainage point. You might wonder how they managed to conceal it. One of the Leadership Council members was an exceptionally skilled engineer. He figured out how to make cement from soil and simple materials. The resulting cement matched the exact color of the drain floor. He then crafted a cement slab precisely the size of the tunnel opening, which had been carefully cut into a perfect square. It was an ingenious entrance. The third entrance belonged to Tunnel Tom. It was similar to Harry's, located beneath a stove in another hut. However, unlike the first, this stove did not sit on a ceramic plate. Instead, it rested on a cement slab. When the prisoners tried to lift the stove, the cement began to crack. You might think this wasn't a big problem. They could simply use a stove in another hut. But they couldn't, because most stoves weren't positioned over concrete pillars, and they needed to dig into those pillars to keep the entrance hidden. So, what did the engineer do? He created a brand new cement slab to place under the stove, reinforcing it with a wooden frame. Even if guards saw it, they would suspect nothing. The prisoners were able to lift the stove while it was still in use, allowing one man to climb down and work in the tunnel while others sat around, shielding him from view. The stove looked completely ordinary, arousing no suspicion. This setup lasted for several months, and all 3 tunnels progressed smoothly. But one day, during a routine inspection, guards entered the hut containing Tunnel Tom. The entrance was under the stove, beneath the cement slab the engineer had made. By chance, one of the guards was holding a stick, and it slipped from his hand, striking the slab hard near the stove. The impact caused a small crack. The guard, curious about the unusual sound, alerted another guard. Together, they moved the stove and discovered the entrance to Tunnel Tom. Once the tunnel was found, the hut was evacuated. Explosives were placed along the entire passage, and it was blown up. This was when the brilliance of Roger Bushell's original idea, to dig 3 tunnels instead of 1, became crystal clear. When the Germans saw the massive effort that had gone into Tunnel Tom, they never imagined there could be 2 other tunnels of equal complexity and size being dug elsewhere in the camp. They immediately assumed all the prisoners' resources, activities, and equipment had been invested into the tunnel that was now destroyed. Rather than tightening security, the Germans actually relaxed. They believed the destroyed tunnel was the only one the prisoners could have possibly dug. However, another problem arose. The Germans decided to expand the camp in the direction where Tunnel David was being dug. This expansion ruined the planned exit. Originally, the goal for Tunnel David was to run from beneath the prison's inner wall to the nearby forest. But with the expansion, the Germans began cutting down many trees in that area, destroying the cover they had counted on. With the exit compromised, Tunnel David was no longer an option. The Leadership Council decided to halt work there and focus entirely on the final tunnel, Harry. Tunnel David would now be used solely as a dumping site for the soil excavated from Harry. All efforts and manpower were now concentrated on Tunnel Harry, with the hope that this would speed up progress. The first task was to install a ventilation system. Prisoners extended an air duct made from condensed milk cans, connecting them along the length of the tunnel. To circulate the air, they used old, worn-out bags placed at the tunnel's entrance. One man was assigned to pump air from these bags into the duct. The second task was to set up a transportation system. The prisoners built a track and placed a wooden cart or trolley on it. This was used to move both the diggers and the excavated soil in and out of the tunnel. As the tunnel grew longer, it became increasingly narrow, making movement inside very difficult. If the prisoners had to keep crawling back and forth with the soil, the tunnel would have taken far longer to complete. With the final length projected to exceed 100 meters, the rail system became essential for keeping operations efficient. The third requirement for faster work was lighting. The prisoners built an underground lighting system by stealing electrical wires from civilian workers inside the camp. Naturally, these workers didn't report the missing wires to the guards. They knew they would be punished if they did. The prisoners also stole several light bulbs from different parts of the camp. They successfully wired them into the camp's electrical system, creating an excellent lighting setup that stretched along the entire tunnel. This truly showed how brilliant the plan was. Surrounded by a team experienced in different trades, even with extremely limited resources, they managed to accomplish remarkable feats. By this point, work on the tunnel was nearly complete. Only a few small tasks remained. They now had to prepare for what would happen after the escape. They began producing forged civilian IDs and documents. Among them were professional forgers, highly skilled in this craft. These men started creating new papers and identities for every prisoner scheduled to escape. This ensured that, once outside, they could travel on public transport such as trains without raising suspicion. However, one problem arose. Official documents and identification required photographs, and their pictures were locked in the prison's inmate files. Only the guards had access to them. In this case, the prisoners resorted to intimidation and manipulation. They came up with a plan involving several inmates who were master pickpockets. For example, one would approach a guard and steal his keys or some other important item. Then, another prisoner would walk up and say, "Hey, I heard you lost your keys." The guard would confirm, and the prisoner would continue, "You know, if we tell the commandant you've lost them, he'll send you straight to the front lines, won't he?" Fearing the consequences, the guard would plead, "Please don't tell him, please." The prisoner would reassure him, "Don't worry, stay calm. We just want a few simple things from you." They would then demand the guard provide photographs, official stamps, or any other materials that could help in forging documents. The guard, not seeing the bigger picture, would comply, believing that photos and stamps couldn't possibly help a prisoner escape. He would turn a blind eye, thinking it was harmless, and cooperate to avoid exposure and being sent to the front. In this way, the prisoners successfully obtained everything they needed to complete the forged IDs and documents. Finally, in March 1944, after more than a year of meticulous planning and non-stop work, the tunnel was fully completed. Everything was now ready for the mass escape. The only consideration left was timing. They didn't want to attempt it on a full moon night, as the bright moonlight could make their movements visible to the guards. Instead, they hoped for a heavy rainstorm to provide cover. But since such weather was unlikely at that time of year, they decided to aim for a night early in the lunar cycle, when the moonlight would be at its weakest. On March 24, 1944, the Leadership Council declared that this would be the night of the escape. All prisoners on the escape list were to leave their huts and make their way to the entrance of Tunnel Harry. The council kept a list of these men and checked each one as they entered the tunnel. The operation, of course, was carried out slowly. Not all the prisoners went together, but rather in small groups to avoid arousing suspicion. One by one, the prisoners began crawling through the tunnel toward the planned exit. But when they reached the end, they faced an unpleasant surprise. There was no actual opening yet. Roger had decided they wouldn't break the surface until the night of the escape. If they had opened it earlier, a patrolling guard might have spotted it, so the plan was to dig the final breakthrough that night. The men at the front reached the tunnel's end, broke through to the surface, and placed a small ladder there. But above ground, an unwelcome discovery awaited them. The original calculations had been wrong. The tunnel didn't come out inside the forest as planned. It emerged outside the camp perimeter, but only about 50 meters from the fence and guard towers. This meant there was a high chance that armed guards could spot and shoot them immediately. The council members at the front decided to proceed anyway. There was no time or opportunity to retreat. The escape began, but the process was slow and fraught with setbacks. That night, a sudden power outage plunged the tunnel into darkness, and part of the tunnel collapsed, requiring precious time to repair. Other unexpected problems arose. The exhausting process of getting prisoners out dragged from 10 p.m. all the way to 5 a.m. The problem was that at 5 a.m., the sun began to rise. By that point, 76 prisoners had emerged from the tunnel and scattered in different directions toward the forest. After 5 a.m., 3 more prisoners were preparing to climb out when a guard spotted them. Armed soldiers quickly moved in to surround the tunnel exit. The men in the opening surrendered and were captured. The rest of the prisoners still inside the tunnel retreated back into the camp after realizing the plan had been exposed. In the end, of the 200 prisoners who had planned to escape, only 76 actually made it out. Still, that was a significant number. The alarm for an escaped prisoner was sounded repeatedly, and a massive manhunt was launched that lasted for weeks. Of the 76 escapees, 50 were recaptured within 72 hours, most only a few kilometers from the camp. The others faced the brutal winter conditions outside. With temperatures plummeting to -22 to -25 degrees Celsius and lacking boots, gloves, or hats, many succumbed to typhus and starvation. A few did manage to make it home and rejoin the fight, but others weren't so fortunate, including Roger Bushell, the mastermind behind the escape. Roger had tried to board a train using his forged identity, but because of the heightened security checks after the escape, soldiers discovered him, and he was ultimately captured. According to all international and humanitarian agreements, prisoners of war are to be treated humanely. They may be punished, but no one would expect them to be executed. Even in previous escape attempts, these prisoners were never put to death. They were simply transferred to harsher prisons. The problem this time was that they had escaped from the most secure prison of all, which enraged Hitler. The first thing that came to his mind was to go to the prison himself, execute all the inmates, strip every guard and commanding officer of their rank, and punish them. However, two of his advisors, Goering and Himmler, persuaded the Nazi leader to execute only 50 of them, in an effort to lessen potential international backlash. Hitler personally oversaw the executions, or perhaps even carried them out himself. He was furious about what these prisoners had done, and although the ending was not what the escapees had hoped for, Roger's plan had at least succeeded in diverting the focus of German forces and leadership. Large numbers of troops were redirected to deal with the massive escape. The diversion strategy worked, and Roger Bushell died with the relief of knowing that the ultimate goal of his plan had been achieved. Though most of the escapees perished, the breakout quickly sent shockwaves across Germany and around the world. It became a lasting testament to the intelligence and courage of wartime heroes. The escape was later immortalized in the film The Great Escape, in which the character Roger Bartlett was directly based on the brilliant real-life leader Roger Bushell. What are your thoughts on this daring escape? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.